Here are 6 sped up drawing demos that I've done, showing buildings that go from relatively simple, this one here, to way more grand, to a great cathedral, but they've all been drawn freehand directly in ink. Let me explain with each of them the process that I'm following to ensure proportion and accuracy. And I hope that you'll be able to see how the increasing complexity of the subject impacts the way, the method, the process, the thinking of its drawing. At the very end, I'm going to pull out a very important point that I think is fundamental if we're learning to draw, that comes from what we learn in this video, in these demos. You can see what I do first here though, is that I establish my starting point. I chose this veranda across the front because it's a series of boxes, so it's relatively easy to get the proportions correct. Well, it's easier than any other part of the scene. And so I start with the simplest part, really concentrating on the angles and the proportions of those lines and the relative spaces that they enclose from each other. And then I start to add the detail. I add the roof to it. I add the detail on the front wall, the windows, the door, but I make sure I keep observing the proportions in my reference. And when I position the corners, I'll often put a dot, mostly put a dot that I then look at and think, is that in the right place? If there's an angle, I might measure the angle with my pen to confirm it. And even with all that, my first lines are normally tentative, not because I lack confidence, but because I don't know particularly what strength of line I'm going to want by the end of the drawing for the visual effect I'm trying to create. And so I leave my options open with a light line. And you see me now adding the effect of the detail, whether it's shadow, the corrugated iron, grass on the ground, all the line work that in many ways gives a sense of reality. It's a simple subject. This still probably took me about 20-25 minutes to draw, largely because of all the line work here, I suspect. This is our first example, and that's my process. The second example is another house, another home, but more complex. It's a 2-story terrace house in Sydney, and it has a more complex downstairs frontage because of these plants and the fence that sit between us and the wall. But I do the same thing. I establish a ruler, I establish some shapes that are easier to draw, in this case the 2 windows taken together as one unit, and then drawing the box around them, working really hard to keep the relationship between width and height correct. Once I've got that, I can now start to spread out from that, using dots, as I said before, to check where I'm putting lines for distance and angle, and being very careful to align things that I'm about to draw with things I've already drawn as per the reference. And that's why you can see those vertical lines I've put on the drawing. I'm still putting on the photo rather, because I'm lining up the things I haven't drawn with the things I have drawn. And as long as I keep all my proportions correct, this alignment method continues to be accurate. But it's why it's so important that the very first thing we draw is as accurate as we can make it. And then the first, if you like, section that we draw, in this case the upper front facade, upper story front facade, is as accurate as possible, because now that whole unit becomes my ruler. And from that I go down, and now doing all those visual effects, the different leaves for the half dozen different plants, and hatching for the shadows and for the trees behind. All the time moderating my line work so that the house stays the star event, stays the main subject, and some context with the gutter in the front. Again, I don't have a tree foliage technique. It's looking at each particular tree in this light and at this distance, and what marks will create the effect I want for my drawing. Next, we jump to a more complex building, a commercial building from the 20s or 30s in Sydney. Now, it's much the same. You can see I've used that central box section as my ruler to draw first, but because it's a larger building, perspective is more dramatic, more noticeable, and therefore I have to pay more attention to that. It's not that I didn't have to do it in the simpler subjects, it's just that it was a little more forgiving if I didn't get it 100% right. But again, the context, the textures, and I use dots for alignment and all of the same things. For this fourth building, we have a commercial building in Hobart. Now, this is a simple example of perhaps of grand architecture. Now, my starting point, my ruler, is the 4 columns on the left-hand side and the space between them. I draw the space as much as I draw the comments. Having done that, I then extended the ruler by going at the top of the columns to the right. I knew I couldn't go down the whole way because of these trees. It's very important that we reserve space that we don't want to draw lines through because there are other things closer to us that are going to be in front of that point. And notice this really important thing I do when I've got a facade with identical elements. I do all those elements at once, and if I can, I do the horizontal lines on every window, say right the way across the length of the facade. And you can see I've done some balustrades up the top, and now really it's the same principle down below. Down below again, it's a little more complex because we have this decorative cutting of the stonework. We have square blocks stuck in between rounded ones, but that's just a little more attention and care. It's not actually harder or different than what we've been doing. Important to just keep the proportions correct and to, again, moderate our line work so that the things we want to feel closest, and the things that are further back feel further back, and the things that we want to be the most obvious thing are the most obvious things. So I'm adjusting my values, making some of my darks darker now towards the end, and some of these buildings on each side as a little bit of context, but again, drawing them a bit lighter and easier so that they feel like they're sitting back a little bit. Some shadow and shade, and again, just correcting the values. And building number 4, done. So we come now to our 5th building. So now the architecture is going from grand civic architecture to grand imperial architecture. Here we have part of the facade of the Église du Dôme in Paris, the place of Napoleon's tomb, his sarcophagus. So what do? Well, I choose a starting point that can become my ruler, and again, I choose what in my mind is the easiest part of this drawing to get correct, basically whatever's rectangular, and that's the center of the lower part of this front facade, this porch. So I do that. Again, I'm drawing the space between the columns, not just the columns, and that helps me get them in the right place, and then I move upwards, aligning with what's happening down below. Now, I probably went up slightly too far, or maybe it's just the entablature that's a little bit too high. I did this drawing a couple of years ago now, but once I've got the bones, if you like, of this sort of architecture in place, then at some stage I get the pleasure of filling in the detail, the decorative elements. So simplifying that, I'm not trying to draw all the detail. That would end up looking too intense. But I want to create the visual effect that the architectural ornamentation gives. Now, with this perspective, going up the drum of the dome and then the dome, really important to realize that as curves go above eye level, they increase in roundness. The curves become fuller and fuller. And so I want to try and remember to reflect that in these curves as they get higher, as the dome's drum and then the dome go higher. Any lines, horizontal lines on those forms will become rounder and fuller. Really important with the decorative work here to just create the impression of that decoration on the dome, not to get bogged down into drawing an exactness that will be impossible to draw accurately, convincingly. And so now, again, a bit of context around the edges, and then we come back to adjusting the values. I hope you noticed when I did this that, again, lots of dots on the paper as approximation points, estimation points that I can then use to check, and if need be, I can correct them, I can move them. And of course, if you wanted, you could watch the video and see these a lot slower with a more detailed commentary if you want. So now adjusting the values at the end, which we can't really do until everything's in place, and then we adjust all the values together so we don't go too dark too quickly in an area that we don't want to attract that much attention to, that we leave our darkest possibilities for the areas that the composition and our purpose want us to make the darkest areas. And then, I don't know, honestly don't know why I did that frame around it. But now we come to our most complex drawing, and it's also the largest drawing. This is probably twice the size or more of most of the drawings that you've seen. This is the cathedral in Berlin. But what do? Well, I start with a section that's fairly rectangular that I think I can draw in proportion. And that's in this closest corner to us. And having established that first bit, I then extended up and aligned more details and established how high this section was going to go in relation to the section I'd already drawn. And so now moving out in each direction. A lot of columns and whatnot to draw. When we have a lot of vertical lines such as we have here, have to be really careful that we don't get width creep as we move across that comes from the actual thickness of the line we're using. We have to appreciate the fact that in our reference, every line that we see and we draw basically has no width. But our pen, of course, might have a millimeter width, and all of those add up and affect the width of our drawing as we draw it. So we need to make an adjustment for that. We need to pull the lines in so that the gaps don't look quite as wide as they should be, but overall that will stop the building being a quarter as wide as it should be. But I'm doing the same thing. I'm doing dots for alignment. I'm checking angles with my pen. Again, being a grander building, it's a little complex and takes more time. This drawing took me about an hour and a half to draw freehand, but I drew it in one go, and it was certainly an enjoyable experience. But I'm just going bit by bit. Bit by bit, I'm extending, and I'm choosing the direction to go that I think is going to be easiest for me to do, where I can get the most information by alignment and the proportions of things I've already drawn. And then hopefully when I've done that, the next part will become more obvious. And of course, a building such as this, we have to make sure that where we have things such as towers that are the same size and that line up on the horizontal, that the perspective angles are correct as they pass through them. So there's a lot more of the columns and the pilasters and the architraves and the entablatures and the pediments than in the church earlier, but that adds time, makes it more time consuming to do, but it doesn't really change the process. And if we love the architecture and enjoy the process, that's not a problem. I'm using the same skills that I used in the first drawing, but there's just a lot more places to use them. Now doing some foliage, but I'm deliberately in this drawing not adding much context around it because I wanted the architecture just to really float there and take all the attention. So doing the final bits and we're done. So what's the incredibly important fundamental issue that we can see in looking at these 6 drawings of increasing complexity and the process, the strategy in drawing them? Well, I hope you've been able to appreciate that as we move from drawing to drawing, my thinking, my process, my strategy stayed the same. The difference was that as the drawing became more complex, it took longer and therefore required more patience, but it was more of the same. And if we were to compare the first relatively simple house and the cathedral in Berlin and my process for drawing them, and to look at them both in real time, you'd see that I basically took the same time to draw the same number of lines and shapes and to work out the proportions, because the principle is the same. It's just that there's more of it in more ways, in more directions, and therefore we have to be able to keep everything tight and in proportion as we go. So what's the big point about how I should be organizing my drawing practice, my drawing journey from this? And I think it's this, that when I draw a subject, until I can draw it well, there is simply no point moving on to a more complex subject, because it's not going to be easier to do the things that I need to do for a good drawing in a more complex subject if I haven't been able to achieve a certain measure of success in a simpler subject. Because they're the same principles, they're the same strategies, they're the same techniques. It's just that as the subject becomes more complex, we're required to use it in a more sophisticated way, which is unlikely to happen if we haven't been able to use it in a simpler way. So if I do a relatively simple drawing that takes me 15 minutes to do, I then look at it and I work out, have I succeeded? Have I used my drawing strategy effectively here? Has it given me the results that I'm after? If not, then I can do this drawing again, or another 15-minute drawing of similar complexity, and apply those same drawing principles and techniques and approach a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time. Each time only takes me 15 minutes. I can do almost 4 an hour if I really want to push myself. But if I do a drawing that takes me, say, 2 or 3 or 4 hours to draw, that's going beyond my experience, understanding, and ability to do well, then it's now taking me 3 hours to do a drawing that still only tells me what the 15-minute drawing told me, which is I don't have my head around what I need to be doing, and I need to, well, in this case, go backwards. Over and over again, I see people who are drawing subjects that are too complex for where they're at, for the sort of drawing that clearly they want to be able to produce. I understand the enthusiasm, and hopefully that can serve as incentive as we do the slog work of working to understand and to experience and practice, master and develop the drawing techniques that we want to use. If we stick to subjects that are simple enough that we have a chance of succeeding in drawing them in not too long a time period, then we will have that cycle of learning repeated over and over and over again far more quickly and successfully, letting us move on to a more complex drawing, than if we want to jump ahead of what we have the ability to do well. And if you're not sure what level your drawing is at, then do a drawing and look at it and be really honest, or better yet, ask someone else who will be really honest about how well you have captured the accuracy, the proportion, the angles, the values, the lights and darks, the feel. And if there's a consistent thought that simpler subjects do that more effectively, that's probably an indication that that's a place to stay for a while before continuing to do things that are going to leave your drawings looking somewhat wanting. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you enjoyed seeing these demos. If you want to see them a bit slower, you can use the cog icon that's you can see around the screen to actually slow this video down to half speed and watch 1 or 2 of those videos more carefully. But in the end, whatever subjects you draw, however you draw them, however simple or complex they are, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.